your head like me, you got to wear your clothes with dignity. How it was Luck is beautiful. I said, sing it along. Luck is beautiful. Say, I'm black and brown. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality.
And a good evening to you, and welcome to our Friday evening's edition of Politics 101. Of course, today it's our Black Matters edition, Black Matters. It's Friday evening. Our guest tonight is going to be Mr. Vincent Alexander. Mr. Vincent Alexander. And we will be discussing the issue of race, ethnicity, and politics in Guyana. Welcome to Politics 101. Those of you joining us from Guyana, good evening and welcome. Those of you who are joining us from the wider Caribbean, a very good evening to you. Whether you're in Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, good evening to you. Those of you who are joining us from Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, welcome to Politics 101. Of course, so many of you are joining us from Barbados, from Jamaica, and of course, the Bahamas. We sometimes forget those of you who are up there in the Bahamas, and of course, those of you who are in St. Martin, welcome. How about those of you in the British Virgin Islands, and of course the US Virgin Islands? Welcome to you if you're coming at us from the United States of America. Hunting ground there in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, New Jersey, Northern New Jersey. Welcome to Politics 101. How about our brothers and sisters there in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, that metropolitan area, and of course, our brothers and sisters in Baltimore. You know, I do a program on Morgan State Radio every second Saturday of the month in Baltimore. You know, I've been doing that program for over 25 years. I think I started doing it in 1997. The second Saturday of each month, the Caribbean Affairs, the program, and they dedicate 1 hour every second Saturday to the Political Hour with Dr.David is the name of the show. And those of you who are in the Baltimore area, good evening to those of you who are in Chicago. I know quite a few of you from Chicago. Our good friend out there, Sister Yvonne Jackson out there in Chicago. Our brother was an environmentalist, Gustav Jackson, died in unfortunate circumstances, but I happened to do some work with him way back in the 90s. If Sister Jackson is on tonight, a very good evening to you and those of you out there in the windy city of Chicago. I've gone to a couple of places in America, but I always try to remember whether the coldest place I went to was in New Hampshire, Minnesota, or Chicago. Lord, I went to a conference in Chicago. I barely pushed my nose out once. Good evening. Good evening to all our friends on the West Coast of the United States of America, California, Arizona, and you down there in the South, the old South, or they called it the Deep South. Our brother Ozia, who is in South Carolina. The Carolinas have some relations to us in the Caribbean. I think 132 Barbadians, enslaved people, were taken to the Carolinas to do rice farming, starting the rice industry there in North and South Carolina. Good evening to those of you who are joining us from Georgia. Those of you in the Atlanta area, the Atlanta metropolitan area, welcome to you if you're joining us from Georgia. Some of you do join us from Florida. Good evening to you. And of course, whether you're in Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee, Virginia, Southern Virginia, welcome to Politics 101. If you join us from Texas, as I know some of you do, welcome to Politics 101. Good evening, Canada. Most of you are in Ontario province, Toronto metropolitan area. Welcome to Politics 101. And good night. Good night to you if you're joining us from Europe, the United Kingdom. Tonight we are going to be discussing this whole question of race, ethnicity, and politics. It never goes away. It never goes away, and it wouldn't go away. The issue of race and ethnicity and politics, it wouldn't go away. Everyone is trying to come at it from their own perspective, and redefining terms, redefining concepts. We're going to have our brother Vincent Alexander on tonight, and while he's here, we'll take the opportunity to catch up on what's happening at GCOM, what's happening at ITPADA-G. You know, we try to squeeze as much from Vincent whenever he comes on, because he wears so many hats. One of the problems that we face these days is that we don't have as many activists as we would like to have, you know, and so some of us have to be wearing so many hats. We would like to see more young people becoming activists and getting in to not necessarily the electoral politics. That's one part of our experience, but really, you know, the so many dimensions of politics. I mentioned Gustav Jackson a few moments ago. You know, environmental politics is a very important aspect of our politics. Very important aspect in Guyana because of the oil industry. Some of our activists are trying to sensitize us to the question of the environment while we are reaping the rewards from the oil discovery. We have to be mindful, very mindful of consequences, environmental consequences. You know, if there's an oil spill, how do we deal with that? So, you know, environmental politics are very, very important. Very important. Those of us who are in the United States, North America, remember that Valdez oil spill. And even in Guyana, at the time of that company, the name escapes me at the moment, that was there, you know, mining gold, and you know, they had a chemical spill in Guyana, and I wonder whatever happened to that issue, if it was ever amicably resolved. Um, and so we have to be mindful of the environment. We'll try to get some of the environmental activists to come on to our show to talk a little bit about that. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101. It's Friday. This week has been quite a hectic week because Monday was nomination day for local government elections, and there was a lot of flurry around that event, largely because in a sense, we have three positions that we are trying to grapple with. The PPP trying to use the election as a battleground for their total control of the country. Then we have the PNC, which has decided that it had to contest the election partially in order to prevent the PPP from getting total control of their strongholds, especially the urban areas, Georgetown, Linden, New Amsterdam, Bartica. And then we have the AFC and the WPA, which have announced that they would not be participating in the election. And so those three positions are there, and the citizens have to navigate those three, if you will, contending positions. For us in the WPA, we are very clear. Our position is that we will do nothing to give comfort to the PPP. We will do nothing to help the PPP. And we will do nothing to undermine opposition solidarity. I repeat, we will do nothing to give comfort to the PPP. We will do nothing to help the PPP in its agenda. And we will do nothing that would undermine opposition solidarity. That is our position at this hour as we look at the local government. That is our position as we look at the local government election. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101. Last night I had a couple of the young people from the PNC on, and we are going to be checking in with them as the weeks roll on. But don't forget that there is still that court case. The case that was brought challenging the Minister of Local Government's authority to mess with the constituency boundaries. I think that the court is supposed to rule on that case, on May 16th. And depending on what's the ruling of the court, we don't know what would happen with these elections. So the elections themselves are not a done deal. They're not a done deal because that court matter is still hanging there. They're still hanging there. And we don't know how that ruling will go and whether it would affect the election in any way. We saw yesterday also both parties challenging each other in terms of the lists that were presented. The PNC was able to present evidence in some of the constituencies where the PPP fraudulently produced a list of names to back the list of candidates. I saw one of the sheets with the same handwriting, writing in people's names. one on handwriting, writing in names on the sheet. So it seems as though the PPP has already been caught attempting to rig the elections. We have to always be cognizant of that we have a voters list that is porous, that is unclean. We have over 200,000 extra names on the list. We have that voters list. And that voters list could always be manipulated, as we saw happened in 2020. Then we have the personnel at GCOM who are predominantly loyal to the PPP, the top personnel. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that that lays the foundation for manipulation of the election. We don't have any means of ensuring that the 200,000 people and perhaps more who are on that list cannot vote. We have no means of ensuring they don't vote. The government commissioners, aided by the chair of the commission, have voted against biometrics. Of course, the list cannot be cleaned, given that the court has said people cannot be taken off the list. We cannot disenfranchise people who are on the list. And so it will take legislation to ensure that the list is being cleaned. And the PPP is resisting legislation to clean the list. So the local government elections face the possibility of being rigged. And as we have now learned, thanks to the 2020 election and the recount, we have now learned that elections are rigged long before election day. And so even the lists that are being presented to contest the local government elections, we see early evidence of the rigging of those lists. So even as we participate in the election, that is the PNC/AFC, even as they're participating in the election, we also have to keep up the vigil and the struggle for a new voters list and a clean and credible elections machinery. That struggle cannot be dropped. That struggle has to continue. My own reading of the PNC's participation, and I think it's a reading of many of us, it's that they're participating under duress or as a form of protest. Because they're participating to defend their territory and, in a sense, push back the PPP from having total control of the governance in Guyana. But that cannot be the only concern. We have a national election coming. The concern has to be cleaning the electoral machinery. It's one thing to, participate in it as a form of protest. And I hope the PPP, the PNC, make that very clear, that their participation is a form of protest and not an acceptance of the electoral machinery. That electoral machinery has to be cleaned. I shudder to think that we would go to a national election with that voters list, with the staff as it is at GCOM, with no biometrics. And if we allow this election to be treated in a normative way, that it's a normal election, then we would be defeating our own struggle to ensure a clean electoral machinery that is agreed upon by both sides. That has to be the ultimate struggle. For us in the WPA, that is our primary struggle as far as elections are concerned. We do not reject elections, as some people on the other side are trying to say. We do not reject elections. We have participated in elections, and we would participate in elections in the future. So we are not rejecting elections. We are rejecting elections that are crooked. We are rejecting elections in which governments are installed. We are rejecting elections that lead to the domination of one party over the rest of the society. I want to repeat that. We support elections as part of the democratic process. Very clear about that. Very clear about that. But we reject elections that lead and facilitate rigging. Crooked elections, we reject that. We reject elections that are used as the site of regime change, that you disregard the elections and you install a regime. We reject those elections. And finally, we reject elections that lead to one-party government. I hear people are prattling about we need a strong opposition. We don't need any strong opposition. We need a strong government. And the strongest government you can get in Guyana is a government that represents all of the peoples of Guyana. And since Indians have made clear they don't want to be governed by Africans, and Africans have made clear they don't want to be governed by Indians, it means that we have to have a joint government reflective of the representatives of Africans and Indians, and of course, our Amerindian brothers and sisters, Chinese and Portuguese and mixed people. So WPA position is very clear. We do not want elections that are rigged. We do not want elections that facilitate regime change and the installation of one party over the other. And we do not want elections which at the end of the day give one party the power to lord it over the rest of the society. So we reject rigged elections. We reject fixed elections. And we reject elections that lead to a tyranny of the majority over the rest of society. I want to make that very, 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 very clear. And we feel that the 2020 elections had all the signs of a bad election. It was an election that was rigged from beginning to end. It was an election that led to regime change, that is, the installation or the installment of one party over the other. And thirdly, it has led to a one-party government that has used the majoritarian system to take control of the government, the state, and the society. That is, our elections of 2020 have led to a dictatorship. A dictatorship that is partly ethnic, that is partly fascist, that is partly apartheid, that is what the elections of 2020 have led to. And we are at this critical juncture that we have to fix our electoral system. Because if the trend continues, this trend continues, where the PPP keeps the electoral status quo, that allows them to rig the elections, and they continue to be sweet with the external forces in the context of a crooked electoral machinery and a geopolitics that takes sides, because at the end of the day, foreign companies and foreign countries look after their interests, not our interests. And if their interest coincides with the PPP interests, they will support the PPP, or at least they will not buck the system. So the combination of external dynamics, a crooked electoral system, it would mean the perpetuation of a one-party government as normative. So I am arguing, we are arguing, reject that nonsense of a strong opposition. You don't want no strong opposition. Let me tell you what a strong opposition ought to be doing. A strong opposition ought to be creating confusion in Guyana, making Guyana ungovernable. That is what a strong opposition to dictatorship does. A strong opposition to dictatorship doesn't go into the parliament. A strong opposition to dictatorship would make Guyana ungovernable. Is that what we want? An unstable Guyana? So I reject that notion of a strong opposition. I want a strong government. And the strongest government we can get is a government of all of the people. And some people believe that power sharing is, the PPP puts it as though we want their power. According to a crooked election, they got 51% of the vote. That is all they're entitled to in the government, in a crooked election. So power sharing is not begging them for their power. Power sharing is affirming that 49 cannot mean 0 and 51 cannot mean 100. That is what we have now. My good friend Ravi Dev says the coalition won in 2015. The PPP won in 2020. And in 2025, the coalition could win because we have no ethnic majority and all that snake oil that he sells. What they're encouraging is either two things. Is either they're comfortable in their minds that the PPP will hold on to power forever and forever, or they're saying, let us change government after each election and let's fight. The PPP wins this storm, we fight them, then they lose the next storm, they fight we. That is what Ravi Dev is peddling, and that is what the PPP is peddling. And that, we're going to get these crossover votes. Indian people do not want to be governed by Africans. And Africans do not want to be governed by Indians. Azra, the Society for Racial Equality, the African Society for Racial Equality, headed by Sidney King and H.H. Nicholson in 1961, in putting forward the power sharing arrangement, said that they had come to the conclusion that Indians do not want to be governed by Africans, and Africans do not want to be governed by Indians. And all the elections we have had since then, that is the verdict. That is the verdict. And so the arrangement that they're talking about, the arrangement assumes that Indians want to be governed by Africans and Africans want to be governed by Indians. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101 on a Friday night. We know that you would rather be doing some other things, but your commitment to the struggle means that you are here. And my guest is here, Brother Vincent Alexander. Let me bring him in right away. Good evening, Brother Vincent.
Good evening. Sorry for my lateness, but got caught up.
Yes, well, when you wear so many hats, we were talking about that. Activists these days wear so many hats, and you have to be here, there, and everywhere. We wanted tonight to talk about this issue of race, and we hope we will get some time to talk about it. But bring us up to date on what's happening at GCOM. Nomination day was on Monday. We have a court case that is still to be determined. I think the ruling is supposed to be sometime in May. Where are we as far as the electoral arrangement and the electoral schedule is?
Well, as we speak, GCOM is still processing the nominations that have been made. And as they process, they're advising the various candidates and the various parties and the various local authority areas and constituencies as to whether their nominations have been approved. That is largely what's happening at this time. GCOM, for all intents and purposes, seem to be working towards a Monday deadline when the commission will then give its fiat to the process that is now being undertaken. It's interesting to note, though, that in the process, there seem to be a number of issues that will have to be resolved. You may have noticed that there is one instance where the vice president has gone on social media to render an apology for the submission of a dead person as a candidate for the PPPC. The person died sometime, and the person's name was down as a candidate, and the person's husband who died, his name was down as a signatory. So those are the kinds of matters we will have to be looking at, because there are a number of complaints which have been received about instances where, in one instance, people who did not render their own themselves have been found to be on the list. And there's another instance, for example, in Wakanam, where there's a contention that people who had signed up have been intimidated and have gone to withdraw having signed up, although their names were on documents which were previously been approved. So what we're doing, as I said, is the administration of GCOM is processing the nominations, and the various stakeholders are making relevant observations and relevant complaints, and GCOM now has to respond to those. I'm told some of these matters are also matters which have been reported to the police. So that for me, where I sit, that one incident is enough. You don't need more than one in this instance. It's enough for me to continue to contend that we have difficulties in terms of a bloated list. Not only do we have difficulties in terms of a bloated list, we have people who are prepared to use the names of dead people. I mean, it is probably very strategic and astute of the vice president to render an apology. But the fact of the matter is, there was someone representing his party who saw it fit to use the name of a dead person, and not one dead person, two dead persons. So for all of those out there who have been continuing to shout that the system is perfect, and I know that is what will be said in this instance, that the system worked, like what was said when Boudou did what he didn't was correct, and the system worked, that's what's going to be said. The fact of the matter is that once you have dead people on the list, it remains to the human factor to get it right. And we know evidence is out there. The human factor is prepared to misuse the names that ought not to be on the list in an attempt to benefit from either those votes, in this instance, from someone being a candidate who, in fact, is dead.
Vincent Alexander here tonight, and Vincent must have been peeping into our conversation, because exactly this is what we had been talking about, that this election is not just about participating, but it's also about scrutinizing the electoral machinery to unearth the instances in which an election can be tampered with long before election day, and to use that to make the case for a cleaning up of the electoral machinery. I had not heard that news. So we have now graduated from dead people voting to dead people being candidates. And I agree with you, Vincent. I don't need 1,000 instances. One instance is enough to make the case that you cannot leave it to human beings, to partisan people, to use their discretion to make the system work. It's like saying you leave $1 million and you put somebody to watch man the $1 million.
The cat to watch the milk.
To watch the milk. You put in the cat to watch the milk. And I agree with you. We don't need 1,000 instances. So You have confirmed what we've been talking about before you came
In
on.
fact, it's the relatives, the children of the dead persons who came forward asking GCOM to take down names of their dead parents.
There we go.
GCOM itself, the mechanism of GCOM itself did not discern this, and it is the parents, the children of the dead person, who came forward and said, look, my father is dead, my mother is dead, but why are they being approved as candidates? Please undo this. And this is interesting, because during the course of the claims and objections, we raised this matter of proof. There were instances where relatives came forward and said that, the person is dead. And they said, well, you need to bring a death certificate. So the system does not give the benefit of the doubt to someone who is prepared to sign an affidavit saying that person is dead. They say, bring the death certificate. And so they allow those names to go through. They allow those names to go through. The system is flawed. We have the argument of the government that they have reformed RUPA with the intent of strengthening the system, but there are certain elements of the system which are known to be flawed. Nothing has been done to strengthen them.
Vincent Alexander bringing us up to date, and what this says to us, brothers and sisters, is that we have to be on this case on a daily basis. This is an enormous task. And perhaps this is the reason, Vincent, why you and your brother commissioners nominated by the opposition side were apprehensive about going into elections without all the arrangements in place. No?
Our apprehension is fundamental to the question of the list. And though we are continuing to carry out our duties, we have made it clear that we are not confident and did not in fact support going ahead with these elections, since the fundamental issue of sanitizing the list has not been addressed. And the intermediary mechanism, biometrics, which could help in that process, even if we don't take the names off, also has not been embraced.
We hear it here for ourselves. Vincent, we will come back in the coming days to keep on top of what is unfolding. This is the first time, certainly in my time of observing elections, that we have had an instance of a dead candidate on the list. And it seems as though this person died a long time before.
In this instance, the person didn't die very long, but the fact of the matter is that the person would not have been alive to sign any document.
There you go.
So it doesn't matter whether the person died long or no. The person died and did not himself append his signature as a nominator, nor did the other one append her signature as a candidate.
And so, Mr. Alexander, we have a certain attorney general representing a certain government that says that people should be jailed for trying to rig an election. Are persons who put that man's name on the list without his signature, are they liable to be prosecuted according to the Honorable Attorney General?
Undoubtedly, those persons have committed an offense and should be brought before the courts. An apology by the Vice President should not suffice. That is opportunistic. That is strategic. It does not undo the fact that an offense has been committed.
There we go. There we go. Vincent, let me shift gears and take you over to it, Padre G. I know there the cases before the court, and there's certain arrangements that are made in the court, and so I wouldn't want you to violate the court. But the government has said that it will bypass it, Padre G, and give this year's subvention to the affiliates of Ipadaji. Ipadaji said, and I know you were quoted in the media, I think both a letter and you were quoted in news stories saying that you would not tell your affiliates what to do in the event that the government goes through with its threat. But is the government itself not violating the law by giving this money, purportedly giving this money to affiliate group as opposed to Ipadaji?
We will give a pass on that in this sense.
Okay.
Our disposition is that the government reserves the right to give grants. And the extent to which the matter is before the court is the extent to which those grants cannot be seen as a subvention which is in contention. The Attorney General sought to say that they're given grants for 2023 and not given for the sum outstanding for 2022 on condition that that is before the court. I would say that in the matter we have filed before the court, that matter is not restricted to the outstanding grant for 2022. It covers the grants up to 2024. And therefore, for us, we have no problem if the government wants to give organization grants. We will not tell the organizations whether to take it or not to take it. They have some degree of autonomy in terms of their operations. They're not subordinate to us in any way. Even if they were subordinate, our position is that if the government wants to give out grants, it can give out grants, but that does not in any way affect the matter before the court, which covers the subvention that's outstanding and the subvention to come. On the matter of the grants, though, we had reason to make a public comment that we find it, in some regards disrespectful for a government to ask organizations to submit proposals within 48 hours. And there are no clear guidelines. All that they said is that submit proposals within 48 hours, and those proposals should be within the context of the goals of the International Decade for People of African Descent. There are no clear criteria, no clear guidelines, so that we really don't know what the government intends to do, how the government intends to proceed, how the government intends to deal with issues of accountability, even with the issue of determining that the proposals are within the mandate. But the government is free to give out grants. Organizations are free to take up those grants. The Ipadaji continues this matter in the court in relation to its subvention.
For those of you who've been wondering why Mr. Alexander and Ipadaji described it as cash grants, I jumped when I read it and I said, well, what's this? There must be some technicality. Well, you heard Mr. Alexander here tonight. If the government gives money to these organizations, it would be their cash grants, because what is before the court is not 1 year subvention. What is before the court is the subvention that the government assented to when Mr. Granger first initiated this exercise. And so therefore, let us leave it there, because the court will have an important rulings to make in this regard. Suffice to say that a government that likes to talk about the rule of law starts out on important matters without consideration of the law. And that I think is instructive. Vincent, apart from you're a commissioner, you were a politician, you deal with Ipadaji and so forth. You also take an active interest in the issue of race and ethnicity and the challenges that that we face as a society in navigating these constructs. The other day, I pulled up something that you wrote decades ago in a magazine that was edited by Professor Selvin Ryan called Caribbean Dialogue. You remember that?
Yes, I do recall that.
I pulled it up the other day as I am writing something, an academic article, and I wanted to use it. So you're not a just come when it comes to this issue of race and ethnicity. You were part of that group of people from the PNC who engaged this subject actively 30 years ago. The question of race, ethnicity, and governance in Guyana. That issue never went away. It has always been there. But instructively, and I suppose justifiably, in this new era of oil, the issue presents itself anew. And I was looking at a program the other night where this discussion was being had. You didn't say much. And as I sat there, I understand why you didn't say much, because it was difficult to say much, given the tenor of the conversation by the other panelists. They were making assumptions about Guyana, in my humble opinion, that do not fit reality. They were talking about democracy and ethnicity outside of the real meaning of what that means. And I think what the fundamental error that all of them were making, some I think intentionally, because I think Ravinev knows better. He knows better. I don't know about the others, but I know Ravinev knows better. And I think the fundamental error is that Africans do not want to be governed by Indians, and Indians do not want to be governed by Africans. Of course, that's that generalization, and that our electoral returns have, in a sense, proven this. Would you please comment on that that assertion?
Well, the first thing I would say is that Guyana is a plural society.
Mhm.
And plural societies can be configured in various ways. You can have a plural society where there is one ethnic group, but there's strata. You can have a plural society where there are ethnic groups. In the case of Guyana, the plurality is more or less around the fact that we have ethnic groups. There's no automaticity that ethnic groups can't work together. But when one looks at Guyana's history and the way in which things have evolved, that is what lends to the difficulty. That is what lends to the difficulty. Ethnic groups are naturally different from a cultural belief and other perspectives. So they're naturally different. So they're naturally challenged as to how they could work together given their differences. However, when you're in a situation like the one in Guyana, where the ethnic groups have been historically pitted against each other, then the difficulty of them working together arises, and the tendency is for the groups attempting to have dominance one over the other. And in those circumstances, one has to seek to create a system that allows for the groups to be involved without domination, allow the groups to have their diverse interests looked after, and allow the groups to collaborate on the question of the commonalities so that you have a cohesive system at work. If you don't recognize that in the first instance, they are different, and that if that difference is built upon in a struggle for power and domination, then it simply will not work. It simply will not work. And therefore, a solution has to be sought. And that solution has to be to find a way in which, on one hand, you accept and do not interfere with the diversity. On the other hand, you find commonalities and a system that allows for the diversity to flourish and for the commonalities to be the basis for them working together. And I think that's the challenge which Guyana is faced with. We have to remember, Amerindians were here first. Came the Europeans. They didn't have a cordial relationship with the Amerindians. They came and sought, in this first instance, to say to trade with the Amerindians, and then found themselves trying to enslave the Amerindians. That immediately is a power relationship. Then they brought the people of African descent, Africans actually. And the fact that they brought them and enslaved them, that too created a chasm between the people of African descent and the Europeans. But more than that, they also sought to have the Amerindians capture and or decapitate the people of African descent who sought to escape from enslavement. And so that created a kind of antagonistic relationship between the people of African descent and the Amerindians. And then came the Portuguese. And every instance when people came, things were done that sought to pit them against each other. So there's no natural brotherhood based on the way in which society has evolved. So when you take the fact that the people are different, and then you take the fact that they don't have the basis or have not engaged in a conversation to overcome the artificial element of power that divides them, in addition to the natural division, then you have to confront that problem. And that's the problem which we have refused to confront. There are those who contend that, there's no problem, we all live happily and so in Guyana. But it must be tremendous dishonesty for people to say that, because they must know what they say and do at the level of their families and their communities about the other ethnic group. We have to be honest. We have to be real. And so, when people attempt to raise this question, some people say, well, you're a racist. But the fact of the matter is, the people who raise the question are the ones who are really not racist, because they're trying to resolve a problem and to bring a resolution to a problem and to create cohesion. You can't be a racist when you're trying to create cohesion, but you must address it from a perspective. If you're an African Guyanese, you address it from the African perspective, but respectfully so. So there's not addressing from the African perspective, proclaiming yourself to be superior. You're addressing from the African perspective, claiming that you want a system that accommodates, that facilitates your being, and not expose you to exploitation, expose you to racism in a system of diverse groups. And that is what we have got to have a conversation about. In that context, this system we have of a majoritarian rule does not facilitate the conversation. It does not facilitate the understanding and the recognition of our plurality, and therefore facilitates the imposition of majoritarian rule, ethnic rule. And that word majoritarian rule is a word we now have to address. Because our colleagues are saying, well, we have emerged in a society of minorities, and therefore we can no longer speak about majoritarian rule. But when we speak about majoritarian rule, it's not merely a numbers question. Issues have to be looked at from a quantitative and a qualitative perspective. And what we see from the qualitative perspective is that there is dominance when one group is in government, irrespective that they may have votes from others, dominance that is ethnicity. And therefore, that question has to be addressed. The question of being able to win an election, although you are a minority, does not address the fact that when you win that election, it is still your belief system, it is still your ideological, probably ideological disposition, it is still your disposition towards wealth, it is still your disposition towards others. That in Guyana is critical from a historical perspective. Your disposition towards others that drives the way in which you use the power you have to manage the society.
And so, Vincent Alexander, you are raising the question of a definition of democracy for a society like ours. Definition of democracy is always engage scholars and thinkers and activists. The democracy of the Greek civilization, where the Western civilization traced their origin, it was a direct democracy. But it was a direct democracy for part of the society, because
a direct democracy in a plural society where some are excluded.
There's some who were excluded. So the contention about what is democracy has always been there. And our comrades on the other side are really presenting a democracy as something that is fixed for all time and for all places. Our own Otto Lewis, not known as a political theorist, he was more an economic theorist, but certainly understood that economics cannot be divorced from politics. In 1965, laid out something for us to think of about how democracy should be constructed in an ethnically plural society like ours. Your comments.
Oh, we have sufficient research that has been done, not necessarily from an abstract perspective, but looking at the actuality of ethnic plural societies, that tells us, on one hand, that those societies pose a problem in terms of classical, I call it classical democracy, and that there are probable solutions to those to that problem, and that those solutions largely can be found in the concept of inclusivity, as some people refer to it, or in the concept of power sharing, as others refer to it, which allows for the various groups to come together and to formulate a way in which, in governing, they will facilitate diversity, but at the same time enhance commonality, and therefore create an environment in which all will be beneficiaries, and there will be none who are considered less than the others. And so that is where our thinkers have taken us in this regard. And interestingly, in doing so, one of the societies that they have referenced from a practical perspective was Suriname. That although Suriname may not have had a formal power sharing arrangement, what we found in Suriname, and this was referenced, I think Fornival may have referenced Suriname, what we found was that every time they had elections, after the elections, based on ethnic parties, there were three essential ethnic parties in Suriname at one time. One which was referred to as the Creole Party, One is referred to as the Hindustani Party, and one is referred to as the Javanese. Javanese. Those parties would come together to collectively form the government so that in the decision making, in every instance, they would take into consideration how their decisions impact the various groups and therefore have a decision mechanism that would facilitate a cohesive society. So what we have is a theoretical situation on this matter, but we also have seen applications of that in practice. And Suriname, I would suggest, is a relatively good example of how that has occurred. There are other places where these issues have been addressed, not necessarily under power sharing as a formal mechanism, but certainly attempts to ensure that there is a certain level of integration into the governance system that does not diminish diversity, but enhances diversity whilst trying to address commonalities all within one matrix. I think I may have lost my host there, and this would be a
There we go. And you're quite right, Vincent. In places like Kenya and Zimbabwe, where there was actually ethnic violence, and the power sharing was put in place to actually stop the violence. Um, and when the power sharing breaks down, the violence erupts. Kenya is going through some of that right now. We just had the Good Friday Agreement that broke down last year, and they're now trying to make sure that it goes back. And of course, the Mandela formula, which Dr. Jagan had promised to implement when he came to power in 1992. Mandela preempted all of that by when he took power, ensuring that the apartheid party
part of the government.
was part of the government. You see? And so we have these instances where people are saying it is not trust that must drive power sharing. It is to ensure the security of all ethnic groups that is most important. Vincent, I heard you the one time that you intervene on this issue of ethnicity, you made a profound point that set me thinking for the last couple of days. And that is, how do parties treat with this question of ethnicity, especially parties which draw their support from ethnic groups? Is it that these parties must say that we draw our support for ethnic groups, but we are multiracial, therefore giving the parties, as we do in Guyana, a choice to say, I represent Africans, or I represent Indians, or I am multiracial? You put forward a brilliant formula as to how parties should treat with the different ethnic groups in their party, to then deal with national issues and ethnic issues at the same time. Over to you.
Well, David, that idea is not new.
I
In
know,
terms of
I know.
me putting it forward in the People's National Congress.
Right.
That's an idea I proffered under the Hoyt regime. Under the Hoyt regime, I called it at that time that you must have what I call the party was practicing ethnic politics. And some of my colleagues went after me, and one of them accused me of being racist. But what did I mean when I said that under the Hoyt regime? You can't, from what we've been saying, you can't have an ethnic party impose itself on the nation. Any party that seeks to govern a plural society must find a way itself to represent that plurality. Let's find a way to represent the plurality. And therefore, the party has to recognize that in governing, they have to address the issues that are peculiar to the various ethnic groups. And their policies have to be responsive to the peculiarities of the ethnic groups, and it has to be open and overt, that we are responding to the issues that confront each ethnic group, in as much as we are going to be responsive to the issues that are not ethnic. Foreign affairs is not ethnic. Security is not ethnic, particularly defense is not ethnic. And so the party itself has to have a mechanism to come up with policies that are responsive. The fact that these parties may have minorities from the ethnic groups in them provides an opportunity. Because what the various ethnic groups could do at the level of the party is to be a connecting rod between the ethnic group and the party, and to bring to the party the issues confronting the ethnic group they're from, and to take to the ethnic group they're from the positions of the party in relation to dealing with their problems. So that in the party, what happens, there's an ongoing conversation that seeks to address issues concerning the ethnic groups, and there's a kind of a consensus across the ethnic groups in the party as to how these matters can be resolved. So it becomes party policy, although a particular policy may be addressing the problem of a particular ethnic group. So as party policy, all of the party people can speak about it, but the particular ethnic group is represented by persons who can relate back to and fro. And then the same party will then have discussions about things that are not ethnic, things that are common to all Guyanese, and again arrive at policies and programs to address them. So the overall party position would be one which accommodates, addresses, responds to diversity as much as it responds to the commonalities of the diverse groups. And so in that way, you would be responding to a state that is plural in a manner that provides for cohesion insofar as each group is given space in relation to its peculiarity, as much as we all occupy space in relation to the general issues. And you know, David, in 2007, when I was nominated to run for the leadership of the People's National Congress Reform, people seem not to have understood when I said we need a new political culture. That was my mantra, a new political culture, not a culture of dominance, not a culture of people trying to outmaneuver each other, but a culture of the kind of governance that I just spoke to, kind of governance I just spoke to. And that is not a matter of trust. It's a matter of necessity. It's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of necessity. It's a matter of understanding that if we are all in one boat and we do not want the boat to sink and or to stand still, and we want the boat to go forward, we have to find a way in that boat where we can paddle collectively in a direction that allows the boat to go where we want it to go, serving the interests of all of us who are in the boat. And that's the challenge. It's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of necessity. And it's a matter of conscious understanding of the problem which you are confronting and what provides a solution. And anybody who tells you that you have to develop trust first, that person is not serious in the first instance in recognition of the problem and has not thought through the problem in a way that can lead them to a logical conclusion as to how the problem should be confronted. I do not take Jagdeo serious when he talks about trust because when we're having constitutional reform or shortly after there, and the so-called Young Turks of the People's National Congress reform came up with the idea of power sharing and actually made a submission to the constitutional reform process. Jagdeo held a gathering at State House and actually had a statement which was published saying that they must have trust first before we can consider an engagement towards power sharing or inclusivity. And here again, when the question is posed, he's gone back to over a decade ago, saying we must have trust. And the question I would ask him, what has he done to engender that trust? He was in government for 23 years. What did he do to engender that trust? But in fact, it's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of reality. It's a matter of recognizing what the problem is. It's a matter of being selfish in some regards, because if you recognize what the problem is and you want a solution that will be beneficial to you, and the fact of the matter is if you don't have the solution, nobody benefits, then you could selfishly engage in the exercise, searching for a solution. So, this is not a matter of trust. It's a matter of being reasonable, being intelligent, and being committed to a kind of society other than domination. And those who refuse to engage in this exercise, in fact, are seeking to continue a system of domination to the detriment of the people at large. It cannot, it will not, and it has not worked anywhere in the world. Whether it's Norway, whether it's Germany, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's Suriname, they have confronted the problem in one way or the other, consciously in the first instance accepting the problem exists, and then moving on to try to find solutions. Our biggest problem is that we deny. We are in a perpetual state of denial, and therefore are not opening the doors to a probable solution to our problem, and are maintaining a status quo which is not beneficial to any set of Guyanese and to Guyanese at large.
Vincent, you and I and a few other African Guyanese have constantly been trying to engage our brothers and sisters on the other side in open conversation. We have appeared in many fora that are dominated by Indian Guyanese, and I've tried to open a conversation, but I looked on with dismay the other night as our comrades on the other side have made value judgments about the PNC. And to say the PNC has to do this, the PNC has to do that, and the PNC has to do that. And they're not recognizing that they are, given the nature of our ethnic politics, they are saying, well, African Guyanese have to do this and have to do that before this can happen. In a sense, really, and I don't think they quite understand it. I am not sure that Ravi doesn't understand it. I think he understands. In a sense, saying there is a guilty party, and by extension, a guilty race. And as I looked at it, I said, well, where are we going to start this conversation? Did you get that impression?
There was an interesting thing about the way in which people were trying to say what the PNC should be. It is premised on the PNC will not be in government.
Yes, yes,
It's premised on that.
yes. Strong opposition.
You have to be a strong opposition. But implicit in what they're saying is a recognition that they don't want all that they are exposed to under the rule of the current government.
Yeah.
And because they don't want all that they're exposed to, they're trying to find a way to curb without removing.
Yeah.
So it now behoves the PNC to be the curbing factor.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a
yeah.
sense, solving their problem.
Their problems, yes.
Solving their problem. Whilst at the same time maintaining the status quo, which they are in favor of, in some with some caveats. And the caveat is this opposition that must make sure, that their choice is contained. Their choice is contained. And so implicit in what they're doing is an acceptance of the problem.
Yeah.
Implicit in what they're doing is an acceptance of the problem, though they don't seem to accept and or understand. And I do agree with you that I think Ravi Dev is in a different position. I have seen Ravi Dev in some regards like an undulating curve. There are times when he's almost there, and there are other times when he recedes. And so, if anyone so far is someone who should be drawn into the conversation, it's Ravi Dev more than anyone else.
Yes, yeah. With all due respect to the other panelists, I don't think they quite get the problem. But I know, as you've said, after more than 2-3 decades of dealing with Ravi, we know that Ravi understands the problem. And I think he has to navigate between the trajectory of Indian dominance and his belief. I do think he believes that Indian people are subjected to the threat of insecurity, even when the government is in office. And I think he's trying to work out how to keep the trajectory of Indian dominance while at the same time protecting the security of Indians, and thus putting the burden on either the dog or, as he said, the tail that is wagging the dog, and we know who his references with that tail. And I think it's a difficult proposition. It's difficult for him. It's difficult for us. And I think perhaps that is a place to start a conversation. But when you have the other voices, which don't necessarily understand the nature of our society, I think that presents some noise. But anyhow, that's my opinion. Closing thoughts.
The proposition really, the conundrum Ravi finds himself in is a real conundrum.
Yeah.
Of how do you, on one hand, pursue class interests in the context of ethnic dominance. I think from the class perspective, Ravi Dev is working class.
Yeah.
I think he's working class. This problem is not peculiar to Ravi Dev, except that sometimes it has to be dealt with sequentially. You're not always able to solve the class problem and the ethnic problem at the same time.
Yeah.
So let's look at South Africa. South Africa, in many regards, have overcome, let's say, the race problem.
The race problem,
In
yes.
many regards, have overcome the race problem. I mean, there's still elements of it, but they have
Yeah, yeah,
overcome,
yeah, yeah.
in terms of a state, the race problem. But they have not overcome the class problem. And so some of the comrades who were in the struggle and had already envisaged the class reformation can't understand, now that we've won, why the class thing, persists, but that is the nature of struggle. You have different contradictions and they don't all mature at the same time, but you have to consciously understand which is the more antagonistic contradiction at a particular time, address that, and when you've overcome that, then the other contradiction becomes the more antagonistic one that has to be addressed. And so I see, for example, a South Africa now caught up in the second phase, and that is the class problem. And I don't think that we have, in history, we don't have a lot of examples of the resolution
Yeah.
of the class problem as yet. Suffice to say that I would argue that there seem to have been some convergence. Nobody talks about the convergence theory these days, but I think in practice, when one looks to the Nordic and the Scandinavian countries, that there's some element of the convergence that has taken place, and it has lent to the stability of those societies and has lent to the enhancement of the lives of all individuals in those societies. Though there's some differentiation, but at the bottom line is relatively uh, good for everyone because of the way in which they have addressed the problem from a standpoint minimize the wealth gap and allowing everybody to benefit from the wealth of the country. And I think that is where one has to look for a solution when you get to the second stage. How do you minimize the class antagonism by virtue of the way in which human welfare is looked after? Because class struggle at the end of the day was about human welfare, pitting classes against each other. But the solution is how do you reduce the antagonism between classes, even as they continue to be classes.
Thank you very much, Vincent Alexander. As all of you, most of you, are indicating a fascinating discussion that certainly has to be continued, and we certainly will continue this conversation because I think it's essential. In any struggle, at any time in history, thought is extremely important. I know sometimes the day-to-day politics is so grinding on the nerves and on the dignity of people that we sometimes don't privilege thinking through, and thought as part of action and action as an extension of thought. But as we have learned on this program and other programs, it's essential. Vincent, thank you so much for.
Just let me say one parting word, which I may have said in many words before.
Yeah.
But any political party that wants to resolve the problem has to itself or see itself as a microcosm of the problem.
Yeah.
And therefore, the way in which it deals with its own internal relations has to reflect a commitment to a resolution of the problem that it then externalizes into the wider society.
I completely agree with you. And those of you who are wondering why this conversation is essential, I want to remind that part of the angst in the African Guyanese community is the fact that it seems as though the PNC, which is the major party in among Africans, the PNC is not necessarily privileging the concerns and the pain of the African Guyanese community. And that is why we need to have this conversation. And that is why Vincent's thing about how you treat with a party in a multi-ethnic society that draws its support from one of the major ethnic groups, that draws most of its support, how that party navigates representation of ethnic concerns with governance at the national level, whether that governance is a single party governance or a power sharing governance. And that is why this discussion tonight is important, because it's at the bottom of the bewilderment that we see in the African Guyanese community about representation by political parties. Vincent, again, thank you very much, and we shall continue this conversation.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all very much, those of you who stayed on with us. We are certainly going to continue this conversation. As I said, there is a place. There is a place for ideas. No country, no struggle, no ethnic group has advanced without ideas. Ideas and practice are interconnected. Ideas flow from practice, and practice inform ideas, and ideas come back and inform practice. And we are going to hold to that practice. Good night. On the weekend, we are going to have our podcast, The Open Word with Dr. David Hinds. Look out for that at our usual time, 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday, we're going to have our podcast, The Open Word, with Dr. David Hinds. So until tomorrow night, when we come back with The Open Word, have yourselves a good and a relaxing Friday night. After all, it's Friday night.
If you hear that, black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's a texture. Lift your head like me. You got to wear it for